I've done some pretty heavy videos recently, so I decided I deserve to have a little treat. That means I'm going to be talking about the musical 1776, which I'm kind of obsessed with. This will be one of my more chill videos, but it's still going to be educational and also not totally chill because I do have to talk about slavery. Kind of a lot. If you're new here, welcome. Otherwise, welcome back. I'm Abby, and this is Political Psych with Abby. On this channel, I talk about the psychology of politics. If you enjoy this video, it'd be awesome if you like, subscribe, comment, follow me on social media, that kind of thing. I don't usually talk about musicals, although I actually did one sort of about Hadestown with my video about the psychology of solidarity. I would say that I have absolutely no special credentials when it comes to talking about musicals. In fact, I am literally tone deaf, so if anything, I am less qualified than the average person. However, in terms of talking about 1776 from the perspective of political psychology, I'm your girl. There are three main things I really love about 1776. The first one is how human and flawed the portrayal of the Founding Fathers is. Not like they are tortured geniuses, but like they are as petty and irrational and even horny as the rest of us. In other words, it's a very psychological portrayal of politics, hence why it's on this channel. The second thing I really like is how shockingly radical the play was for its time, and to some extent still is. Something that the new stage production, which I'll also talk about, carries on wonderfully. And then the third thing I like is how fun and kind of cheesy, but also genuinely well done this is. I'm going to focus on 1 and 2 in this video. You kind of have to see the musical to get 3. I will mention that while I'm going to talk primarily about the movie production of this show and the original script, I will also be discussing the recent revival production. I saw the revival production in person and thought it was great. I want to mention that it has a racially diverse cast, but not a race-blind casting. Also, the cast of the revival does not contain many, if any, people who would use he, him pronouns to refer to themselves. But I will be using he, him pronouns to refer to the male characters, as the revival does not textually change the gender of the characters. In other words, in the revival, people who are not men are still playing the characters as men. Also, I'm not going to be addressing any reviews of the revival or any drama/controversy because it is incredibly out of my wheelhouse. First things first, I want to talk about why Richard Nixon did not want you to see this. At least not all of it. Well, he kind of wanted you to see it. He wanted you to see the rah-rah America parts, but the song Cool, Cool, Considerate Men was cut from the original film release because the head of the studio, Jack Warner, was pressured to do so by Nixon, who was his buddy. Nixon did not like the song's portrayal of conservatives. I get why. It is just so bitchy about conservatives. It is fantastic. It has them describe their own principles with lines like,
"To the right, ever to the right, never to the left. Where there's gold, a market that will hold, tradition that is old, a reluctance to be bold."
Also, it portrays conservatives as the ones opposed to, or at least hesitant about, the American Revolution, with lines like,
"Why should we risk losing?"
And the revolution is now key to conservative identity, perhaps even more now than it was in Nixon's day. Jack Warner also wanted the film negatives of the number destroyed, but the editors secretly saved them, and so now, if you watch the film version, it should have that number included, and the one you can buy on YouTube certainly does. So yeah, let no one ever tell you censorship is rooted on the left, because a surprising amount of the time, it is rooted in the studio head who served as a friendly witness to the House Un-American Activities Committee, and who was friends with the president who bombed Cambodia. Nixon also wanted Mama Look Sharp cut from the performance of the musical at the White House. Originally, this was surprising to me. Mama Look Sharp is a sad ballad where a soldier mourns a fallen comrade. Then I remembered the Vietnam War, and had a well done moment. Mama Look Sharp is not necessarily an anti-war song, but it is definitely a song that is designed to make the audience question whether war is worth the cost. If an audience allows themselves to even question if the American Revolution was worth it, imagine what they would start to think about Vietnam. Also, this song comes almost immediately after Cool, Cool, Considerate Men. juxtaposing the interests of the rich conservatives with the common soldier. One could see why Jack Warner and Richard Nixon would not like that. The cast refused to perform the play at the White House unless they kept all the songs in. This was a genuinely brave move in my view. Some members of the cast were intimately acquainted with what could happen to you if your patriotism was questioned. Howard Da Silva, who played Benjamin Franklin in both the movie and the original stage show, had previously been blacklisted because he was investigated by the House Un-American Activities Committee as an alleged communist because of his political activities. Impressively, the cast got the White House to agree to the performance of the whole show, hence the surreal image that is this video's thumbnail. Apparently, the cast sang the numbers Nixon did not want sung with extra vigor. It is almost surprising that there is no record of Nixon or Warner requesting that the song Molasses to Rum to Slaves or any of the other content about slavery be cut, because this play is at its most radical and honest when covering slavery. This play tackles slavery in a more head-on way and makes fewer excuses for the Founding Fathers than nearly any other content about the American Revolution I have seen, and I'm including serious documentaries and books that should be embarrassed to be outflanked by a fun musical from the 60s on this. I am mostly going to be talking about this in terms of political psychology and 1776 specifically. If you want an overview of the actual discussions about slavery at the Continental Congress, I am not your best source. This video is really not about historical accuracy, but I do want to let you know that the debate on the contents of the Declaration and the vote on the Declaration are in the opposite order in the play to how they actually were. In reality, the vote came first. This means that the decision-making process of the main characters of the play regarding slavery is different than it would have been for their historical counterparts. This is not at all to defend the historical counterparts. I do want to say that I cannot really bring myself to say that the creation of the United States was worth any degree of complicity in the preservation of slavery. Seriously, while I might have some admiration for some of these historical figures and the sort of fondness for Revolutionary War history one gets from growing up surrounded by it, I go back and forth on whether the war was even worth it, considering slavery remained and was actually abolished about 30 years earlier in the British Empire. That's a whole generation extra that lived through slavery here. Although, of course, the British Empire is also indefensible. At least some of my fondness for the American Revolution comes from a hatred of the British Empire. Nothing against modern Brits, of course, though. Hell, I'm married to one, and he hates the Empire more than I do. The shift in focus to talking and singing about slavery in this play can seem sudden and intense. It functions as a sort of gut punch. There's all this discussion of principles and high-minded rhetoric, and then in the middle of editing the Declaration, and preceded by a discussion of deep-sea fishing rights, the viewer is made to realize that the characters in the show, even the ones they've been rooting for, and the nascent country they have also been rooting for, are at least partially complicit in one of the worst atrocities in human history. Although, on rewatching the play, it can seem haunted by slavery from the beginning. The first hint of this is the lighthearted and catchy song, "The Lees of Old Virginia." In this song, Richard Henry Lee is listing his prominent relatives, all of whom seem to be contemporaries, save for one, blink and you'll miss it name. And that name is Bobby Lee, or as we damn Yankees would call him, Robert E. Lee, the Confederate slavery-defending general and loser of the Civil War. He was also Richard Henry Lee's nephew. In order to confirm this information, I went to the website for the Lee Family Archive. I have to share the final sentence from their page entitled "The Lees of Virginia, An American Legacy." It reads, "Harry Lee's son Robert would also wage war on behalf of a rebel government, but unlike Washington, General Lee's efforts would meet with a very different end." Well, that certainly is an American legacy. The play's focus on slavery is clearer earlier on in the new stage production. Partially, this is due to the diverse cast, which makes it harder to not be thinking about race in America from the beginning. Importantly, this is a diverse cast and not race-blind casting. I really don't think having some of the most vocal defenders of slavery played by Black people would have been a good idea. But I do think that involving people from different backgrounds, especially African Americans, in a play with a heavy focus on slavery and race in America is a very good idea. The diverse ensemble and the decreased need for realism of a stage production rather than a film one also gives the production the opportunity to have people on stage playing slaves in Molasses to Rum to Slaves, which I think is a good touch as it makes the people whose fate is being decided feel less theoretical. Also, in the modern production, in the song The Lees of Old Virginia, they have various lees standing on rum and or molasses barrels in the background, and one of them is in a very obvious Confederate uniform. Now you might be asking, why barrels? Well, rum and molasses take a starring role in the song Molasses to Rum to Slaves, which is about slavery, greed, and profit, especially in the context of the triangle trade, which involved both these goods. It is also about the complicity of the whole burgeoning country, not just slaveholders. Being a New Englander myself, the line from Rutledge,
"Our northern brethren are feeling a bit tender towards our slaves. They don't keep slaves, no, but they're willing to be considerable carriers of slaves to others. They are willing for the shilling,"
brought on a healthy level of discomfort that most portrayals of slavery do not for me. We can also see here that Rutledge is trying to include Northerners in an identity that includes profiting from slavery, in the hopes that this will make them more likely to defend slavery, or at least not actively attack it. This is a pretty clever tactic from a psychological perspective. We're going to be talking more about the psychology of identity later in the video. From a psychological perspective, the treatment of slavery in this play also emphasizes cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is the distress that occurs when there is a mismatch between behavior and attitudes. Typically, according to this theory, there are three main ways people deal with this dissonance. Firstly, they could change one of the dissonant conditions. This could be their behavior, but in a surprising number of cases, people actually change their attitudes instead. Secondly, it could be trying to add things to their thought process that justify their actions. The third option is mentally decreasing the importance of these attitudes. We actually see different characters engage in all three of these strategies in 1776. Rutledge attempts to convince the Northerners and others to go along with continuing slavery by emphasizing how they will profit from its continuation and how their actions would have to seriously change if it ended. He sings,
"Who sail the ships out of Boston, laden with Bibles and rum? Who drinks a toast to the ivory coast? Hail Africa, the slavers have come. New England with Bibles and rum."
Basically, here he is saying that the whole economy would have to be overhauled if slavery were outlawed, and that this is not just true in the South. Keep in mind that most of the delegates are very rich men who have done well under the current system. Rutledge also tries out the third strategy by making anti-slavery attitudes seem less important by saying,
"'Tisn't morals, 'tis money that saves."
Here he is explicitly placing profitable actions as more important than carrying out actions in line with a moral attitude. Also, this line is especially chilling, as you could easily imagine the villains of our day feeling the exact same way. But most of them probably wouldn't say 'tis. Rutledge does not do as much adding things to the thought process as he does the other strategies, but Jefferson clearly does this to himself. When Rutledge asks Jefferson about his slaves, Jefferson replies,
"I have already resolved to release my slaves."
Here, Jefferson is adding the fact that he has resolved to release his slaves to his thought process so he can mentally justify keeping them. To quote the website of Monticello, Jefferson's estate, Thomas Jefferson freed 2 people during his life. He freed 5 people in his will. He allowed 2 or 3 people to escape without pursuit, and recommended informal freedom for 2 others. In total, of the more than 600 people Jefferson enslaved, he freed only 10, all members of the same family. So yeah, maybe he alleviated some of his own cognitive dissonance, but this is still an egregious moral failing. The treatment of slavery in this play also hits harder because of how human and how psychological this play makes its characters. So now I'm going to start breaking it down in terms of psychological concepts so that we can understand how the play crafts these deeply psychological characters and scenarios. The first of these concepts I want to talk about is issue framing. Basically, what that is talking about an issue in certain ways to change the way people think about them, and maybe even what side of an issue they find themselves on. What is super cool about 1776 from the perspective of framing is that it uses theatrical framing to emphasize the ways the characters are engaging in issue framing. Very rhetorically meta. The original production of the play, as well as the revival, start with John Adams in front of the curtain, framing the situation as he sees it by saying,
I have come to the conclusion that one useless man is called a disgrace, that two are called a law firm, and that three or more become a Congress. And by God, I have had this Congress. For 10 years, King George and his Parliament have gulled, cullied, and diddled these colonies with their illegal taxes, Stamp Acts, Townshend Acts, Sugar Acts, Tea Acts, and when we dared stand up like men, they have stopped our trade, seized our ships, blockaded our ports, burned our towns, and spilled our blood. And still this Congress refuses to grant any of my proposals on independence, even so much as the courtesy of open debate.
This is an especially interesting use of framing in the 2022 revival, because in that production, John Adams is played by a black woman, who begins the show standing in front of the curtain with a painting of the actual Continental Congress, who were all white men, on it. This actually calls attention to the themes of race and, to a lesser extent, gender the revival chooses to focus on so clearly that I had to go home after I saw it to see if the same speech was in the original play, which it is. Exactly the same as far as I can tell. Regardless of who plays John Adams, this section still serves as a framing device for the rest of the play. Framing is basically a constant theme in this play about the framers of the Declaration. Please excuse the awful pun. The whole writing of the Declaration of Independence can be seen as an attempt to control the framing of the Revolutionary War. This is true historically as well as in the play. Although I should mention that the largest liberty the play takes with its history is that it reverses the vote on independence and the writing of the Declaration. Historically, the vote came first, which honestly seems crazy to me, but I think this is because, as Americans, we are taught to view the Declaration as a key element of an independence movement. But at the time, this precedent would not have existed. Anyway, regarding framing, John Dickinson, who is in many ways the antagonist of the play, but is undeniably fun to watch, delivers the line,
Mr. Jefferson, are you seriously suggesting that we publish a paper declaring to all the world that an illegal rebellion is, in reality, a legal one?
That is, of course, basically what the Declaration did, and I would say it was pretty successful, considering that almost everyone views the United States as a real country, and the Revolutionary War is commonly viewed as very legitimate, even though at the time it was, of course, completely illegal. Franklin further emphasizes framing by responding to Dickinson with the line,
You should know that rebellion is always legal in the first person, such as our rebellion. It is only in the third person, their rebellion, that it is illegal.
This line brings in framing around identity that we will discuss more later. Also, I just love this line. Franklin is such a scamp. Honestly, the only founding father that I think was actually pretty cool in real life, although not totally unproblematic, of course. If you ever want to feel really bad about how little you've done in your life, read a biography of Benjamin Franklin. There is also a quite intense discussion between Jefferson and Dickinson about whether King George should be described as a tyrant. This might seem like an inconsequential issue of word choice, but it is absolutely not, as Jefferson sums up by saying,
When a king becomes a tyrant, he thereby breaks the contract binding his subjects to him.
Now, I am personally very anti-monarchy generally, but you have to remember that in this period, kings were the norm, typically seen as good, but tyrants you could justifiably rebel against. This is probably why this is one of the few edits to the Declaration that Jefferson refuses to accept. But the characters in 1776 are not all grand rhetoric, although there's a lot of that. In many ways, the real strength of the play is in the humanity of the characters. They mirror real political actors in all eras in that they can be petty and irrational like the rest of us. Let's start with pettiness, because I love drama, especially dramatizations of really old drama. Adams as a character is constantly striving to separate the personal and the political, probably because as a person he is obnoxious and disliked, as the play puts it. Whereas Franklin, who in the play, as well as in many historical accounts, was a charismatic people person, understands melding person and politics. A big part of that is having ideas presented by the right person. Hence, why Franklin decides that the widely liked Richard Henry Lee should be the one to introduce the Declaration. Of course, this is not just Lee's personality, but also his identity as a Southern aristocrat that makes him a good candidate to introduce the Declaration. We will get into the identity stuff later. Boy, howdy will we get into it. And yes, as I mentioned before, he is one of those Lees. Anyway, there is actual science to back up the idea that a politician's perceived personality impacts support for them. For example, Koppensteiner and Stefan found that when people watch clips of politicians, they preferred politicians who they saw as having personality traits they value in themselves. This is pretty obvious that we are biased in favor of people we find likable, even in political situations, but I like that this play does not treat the Founding Fathers as immune from that. But it's not just pettiness. Love, which may not be rational but is beautiful, is also an ongoing theme in the play. This love is anything but pure. The play wants you to imagine the Founding Fathers as downright horny. Look up a song called "He Plays the Violin" from this musical. Just do it. I dare you. This play's focus on interpersonal relationships, including romantic relationships, and the impact politics has on those relationships is something I find very interesting and very important. In my video on dating across political divides, I discuss how political differences can cause tension in relationships. However, in this play, what is focused on more is the strain that political actions of one partner can have on the other partner in the relationship. Abigail Adams sums this up, albeit in a semi-joking tone, with the line, "Think of it, John, to be married to the man who's always first in line to be hanged." For some reason, that line is just relatable to me as a woman named Abigail from Massachusetts, married to a political radical. Can't possibly think why. Okay, in this next section, I'm going to talk about Thomas Jefferson's sexual and romantic life and crack some jokes about it. But before that, I want to acknowledge that after the events portrayed in this play, Thomas Jefferson raped his slave, Sally Hemings. To quote from Vox, DNA evidence has proved that Jefferson and Hemings had 6 children together while Jefferson kept Hemings enslaved. And Jefferson also enslaved their children, freeing them one by one as they came of age. To further complicate matters, Sally Hemings was a half-sister to Jefferson's late wife, the product of a relationship between Jefferson's father-in-law and one of his slaves. By all accounts, Jefferson's sexual relationship with Hemings spanned several decades, beginning when Hemings was a teenager and Jefferson was in his 40s. It was not, in any sense of the word, consensual. Hemings was a child, and Jefferson literally owned her. She was not in any position to give or withhold consent. It is probably better to think of my jokes and comments in this next section as about the fictional character in the play, not the real man. Although, of course, it is impossible to separate them completely. Alright, I can't come up with a good transition for this, but let's get back into things. An entire scene of the play focuses on how Jefferson cannot write the Declaration because he, shall we say, yearns for his wife. He's not able to get it done until Franklin has his wife come to Philadelphia. This is where "He Plays the Violin" comes in. There's actually probably a pretty good lesson in there about how taking care of yourself and your allies' personal needs will help your political movement, but this is also just a hilarious scene and really serves to bring the Founding Fathers down to human scale. This approach of focusing in on romantic relationships of political figures is not necessarily something I want to relate to a specific study, although it has been found that people's social bonds do shape their politics. The real reason I bring this up in a political psychology video is that I want to give the play a standing ovation for really understanding the human element of politics, which is also one of the key missions of political psychology. The Founding Fathers are also displayed in this play as very physically human. The very first song in the show is Sit Down, John, in which John Adams tries desperately to get a vote on independence, and the rest of the Congress primarily complains about the weather, with lyrics like,
It's 90 degrees. Have mercy, John, please. It's hot as hell in Philadelphia. Someone ought to open a window.
I mean, relatable. I also cannot get anything done when it's hot out, and I have AC. FYI, this song is super catchy. You will never be able to tell someone to open up a window without singing again after you hear it. There is some pretty strong evidence that temperature does affect the way we think, in ways very relevant to this situation. Chima and Patrick found that people are less likely to make complicated gambles in warmer weather. Now, the complicated gamble they focus on is a more complex type of lottery ticket. But you know what is also the sort of complicated gamble people might be less likely to make in hot weather? Starting a new country. Fun fact, one of the authors of this article is based at the University of Virginia, which was founded by Thomas Jefferson. So this video is very indirectly brought to you by one of its own subjects. Anyway, Chima and Patrick also found that heat makes us rely on simpler ways of thinking, makes us less willing to engage in complicated decision-making, and decreases cognitive performance. Although it is worth noting that they were focused on contexts like consumer decision-making and copy editing, not politics. We're not quite the Trolls and Terry Pratchett books, but there is a real effect. Yeah, 90 degrees and no AC, 6 layers of clothing, good luck getting much done in the thinking and decision-making department. I should mention, though, that colonial-era clothes, while not great in the heat, are not quite as terrible as you might think. I grew up in Lexington, Massachusetts, the town where the American Revolution started, and like a good little history nerd, I spent the summer after high school as a costumed guide in a historic house. My outfit consisted of a shift, that's sort of a cotton dress you wear as underwear under your clothes. It covers enough, though, that it would be a fairly modest dress by modern standards. On top of that, I wore a petticoat, which is basically a long skirt. I had to wear mine oddly high on my waist because they did not have one short enough. I'm 5'2". I also wore an apron on top of the petticoat. On my top half, I had a jacket, which is really more of a shirt, but is called a jacket. Mine was one that wraps and ties around because that's what they had in my size. But ones that pin clothes in the front are also very common. They had buttons at the time, but it was considered scandalous for women to wear them, or so I have been told. Then there was a shawl worn over the jacket and a bonnet on my head. I have been told this outfit was not very accurate, and I make no claim to be an expert. Anyway, it was odd from a temperature perspective. It sort of felt like being wrapped in layers of thin blankets. Because all the fabric was natural and none of it was very thick, there was just a lot of it. I did hear from colleagues, though, that the men's outfits are worse in the summer, which I would pin on thicker fabrics if I had to guess. Bonnets suck, though. Let's never bring back bonnets. That was a longer digression than I planned. But yeah, the point I'm trying to make here is the importance of seeing historical and political figures as just as human as the rest of us. Capable of bias, but also of things like sweat and horniness and even love. Peter Stone, who wrote the book for 1776, clearly understood that and viewed the humanity of the Founding Fathers as key to the entertainment value of the play. He wrote the following about the play. 1776 was conceived as entertainment, but if it is indeed entertaining, it is, I believe, more than the songs and the jokes and the theatricality that make it so. It is the surprise of discovering our Founding Fathers were men of flesh and blood and not cardboard. Now, let's move on to how these figures relate to each other. Like the rest of us, a lot of these interactions are shaped by perceptions of our identity, especially what collective identities we share. One of the main ways to understand political movements used in political psychology is called social identity theory. I go into more detail about it in my video on solidarity. Anyway, the gist of social identity theory is that in order for a movement to occur, people have to see themselves as members of a group and have to see advancing the interests of the group as a more effective way of furthering their interests than acting alone. Of course, people do also act altruistically to advance a group interest, sometimes even the interest of a group that they are not a member of. Here, though, I am going to be focusing on the defining and redefining of identities and their related interests, because that's what the play focuses on. Adams and Dickinson have an exchange about whether to separate from England that demonstrates the role of social identity rather neatly. I'm going to run through a section of it with some commentary along the way.
Why independence, Mr. Adams?
For the obvious reason that our continued association of Great Britain has become intolerable.
See, here, Adams is trying to define a collective identity that includes himself and Dickinson and frame Great Britain as external to that identity. Dickinson continues by saying,
To whom, Mr. Adams? To you. Then I suggest you sever your ties immediately. But please be kind enough to leave the rest of us where we are. Personally, I have no objections at all to being part of the greatest empire on earth, to enjoying its protection and sharing its benefits.
Here, Dickinson tries to deny a collective American identity and cling to and frame positively his identity as a British subject. He and Adams go back and forth like this for a while, and if you want the whole thing, you should see the play. It's great, but I do want to highlight one more line.
Come, Mr. Adams, if you have grievances, and I'm sure you have, our present system must provide a gentler means of redressing them, short of revolution.
Here, he is asking Adams to act as an individual instead of taking collective action. Individual action, being seen as effective, does tend to discourage collective action. This is also an element of social identity theory I go more into on my video on solidarity. This is also to some extent an example of status quo bias, although suggesting an alternative to war, largely over taxes, is hardly an irrational action. Status quo bias is not always terrible, and Dickinson at this point really does see the war as largely about things like taxes, although Adams has a grander vision. Shortly after this exchange, we get Franklin saying the line,
Nor would I, were I given the full rights of an Englishman. But to call me one without those rights is like calling an ox a bull. He's thankful for the honor, but he'd much rather have restored what's rightfully his.
This is a pretty textbook example of perceived relative deprivation as an element of social identity theory. Relative deprivation means considering yourself or group deprived compared to the group you are comparing yourself to. Considering your group deprived is pretty key to the social identity theory of change, meaning that this comes right back around to issue framing. The play also focuses heavily on the way that different identities can be capitalized upon to further goals. For example, Adams and Franklin decide to have Lee propose independence because he is a Southerner and a wealthy one from a good, read slave-owning scumbag family at that. They need the wealthy Southerners on their side so they can get someone who the wealthy Southerners will see as embodying the best of their identity to champion the cause of independence. Throughout the play, there is also an ongoing attempt by the pro-independent side to craft a positive, unifying American identity. For example, there's an entire song about choosing America's national bird, which is also, in a sly way, about defining the American character. In spite of turkeys just being total assholes, I can't help finding myself agreeing with Franklin when he asserts the national bird should be a turkey because the eagle is
a scavenger, a thief, a coward, and the symbol of more than 10 centuries of European mischief.
Whereas the turkey is
a truly noble bird, a native of America, a source of sustenance to our settlers, and an incredibly brave fellow.
I think the play maybe wants you to wish you lived in the braver, less old-fashioned European, less scavenging, less imperialistic Turkey America rather than the Eagle America we live in today. But I am probably reading too much into it. Although, during the song in the new production, scenes from the good and the bad of American history are projected behind the actors, so maybe I'm not reading too much into it. Also, of course, the Declaration itself is part of the burgeoning national collective identity, but isn't talking about birds more fun? Also, now I really want a turkey sandwich on rye with cheese. We should also talk about the perceived effectiveness element of social identity theory. Basically, people are more likely to take action if they believe that action can be successful, which I guess is pretty obvious, but it's always nice to have double-check these things scientifically. Throughout the play, many members of the Continental Congress are hesitant to act because the war is going poorly and they believe they will lose. One such character who holds these perceptions is Chase, but hilariously, he changes his mind when, in the words of Franklin, he saw
a ragtag group of provincial militiamen who couldn't train together, drill together, or march together. But when a flock of ducks flew by and they saw their first dinner in 3 full days, sweet Jesus, could they shoot together?
By the end, we see collective identity has been formed and that the members of the Congress see themselves as able to succeed together and only together. This is summed up by Franklin saying,
"If we don't hang together, we shall assuredly hang separately,"
as the delegates sign the Declaration. What I've been trying to say with this video, other than that you should see 1776 in some form and piss off Richard Nixon, is that this play takes the Founding Fathers off their marble pedestals and makes us consider them as people. I want to close with an exchange between Franklin and Adams immediately after the decision to concede the slavery issue. Adams says,
"Mark me, Franklin, if we give in on this issue, posterity will never forgive us."
Franklin replies,
"That's probably true, but we won't hear a thing, John. We'll be long gone. And besides, what will posterity think we were? Demigods? We're men, no more, no less."
And that's the wonderful thing about 1776. It shows you people. It does not ask you to treat the Founding Fathers as psychologically different from normal people. If we consider the Founding Fathers as fellow humans, not inherently better or worse than that, it becomes easier to replicate their successes and to fix their mistakes. Thanks so much for watching. Like, subscribe, comment, ask a question for a future video, follow me on social media. Also, I want to offer extra special thank yous to my patrons who make it easier for me to do things like buy books I use for videos. For this video, you guys bought me a copy of the 1776 script. If you also want your pet in the credits and to support the channel, head over to it on Patreon. I also want to thank the wonderful creators who contributed their voices to this video. Links to their various projects will be in the video description. And one more extra special thank you for this video. Thanks to my mom for buying the tickets to the 1776 revival. Love you. Thank you so much.